when my mom's new husband looked me straight in the eyes and quietly said, "If you ever try to take her away from me, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." He expected me to flinch. Instead, I held his stare. A slow smile spread across his face. Then he stepped closer and placed one hand on my shoulder. His grip tightened for just a second, long enough to remind me it wasn't meant to be friendly. I could smell the sharp scent of his expensive aftershave as he leaned in. I didn't say a word. Years of military training had taught me to recognize controlled aggression. Richard wasn't losing his temper. He was studying me, trying to figure out whether fear would make me back down. He mistook my silence for weakness. That would become the biggest mistake of his life. My name is Lucy Price. I'm 35 years old, and after 12 years serving as a U.S. Navy SEAL, I came home wanting something I hadn't experienced in a very long time. Peace. I left my military career behind, accepted a corporate security job, and told almost no one about my past. My mother was one of the few people who knew, and she promised never to mention it to anyone. She'd already carried enough pain. After my father died from cancer 8 years earlier, she never seemed quite the same. She still wore his old wedding ring on a silver chain around her neck. She smiled when she thought people were watching, but when she believed she was alone, the loneliness always found its way back onto her face. Then she met Richard Collins. At first, he seemed like the answer to every prayer I'd ever whispered for my mother. He owned a successful construction company, volunteered at local charities, remembered birthdays, brought flowers every Friday, and somehow always knew exactly the right thing to say. But there were little things that bothered me. Whenever someone asked my mother a question, Richard answered before she could. If she told a story, he corrected tiny details with a smile that looked warm to everyone else. Looking back, I don't think my mother found it charming. I think she was learning not to disagree. 6 months later, they were married. At first, the changes were so gradual that almost nobody noticed. Her phone calls became shorter. Lunches with lifelong friends quietly disappeared. Every small decision somehow needed Richard's approval. Then came the Sunday dinner that changed everything. My mother accidentally dropped a wine glass while clearing the table. The crash echoed through the house. Richard walked into the kitchen. Mom immediately whispered, "I'm sorry." Then she apologized again. And then a third time. Only after her third apology did Richard smile. "Be more careful," he said softly. "I don't like expensive things getting broken." Without thinking, my mother took a small step backward. That single movement told me more than 1,000 words ever could. I stood in that kitchen for several seconds after Richard walked away. My pulse never changed. But every instinct I'd developed over 12 years of military service was telling me the same thing. My mother wasn't married to a difficult man. She was living with someone who saw control as love. Richard hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't touched her. He hadn't left a bruise anyone could photograph. Instead, he threatened people where no one else could hear him. In public, he opened doors for my mother and pulled out her chair with a smile. In private, he quietly decided which doors she was allowed to walk through. That was what made him dangerous. The next morning, I called my mother. Richard answered. "Carol's resting," he said pleasantly. Then there was a brief silence. "Is there a reason you're calling my wife so often?" Before I could answer, the line went dead. An hour later, my mother called from the same number. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I left my phone downstairs." The words sounded rehearsed. Years of military threat assessments had taught me to recognize patterns long before they became obvious to everyone else. Over the next 3 weeks, those patterns became impossible to ignore. Richard insisted on controlling every dollar that entered the house. He convinced my mother to close the bank account she'd shared with my father for nearly 25 years. He installed security cameras outside, claiming they were for protection. Soon he was questioning where she went, who she spoke to, and why she'd been gone for an extra 10 minutes. Little by little, her world became smaller. The hardest part wasn't seeing what Richard was doing. It was convincing my mother that she deserved better. The first time I suggested leaving him, she immediately shook her head. "You don't understand," she whispered. "If I make him angry..." She couldn't finish the sentence. A week later, while Richard was away at a business conference, she came to my house. The moment I opened the door, she wrapped her arms around me and broke down crying. For nearly an hour, she told me things she'd been too ashamed to admit. "He counts the cash in my purse. He reads my text messages before I even see them. If dinner is late, he doesn't yell. He just stops speaking to me for days. Every sentence made my stomach tighten. When she finally fell silent, I reached across the table and held her trembling hands. "Mom," I said softly, "you're coming home with me." Tears filled her eyes. "What if he comes after us?" I looked at her without hesitation. "Then he'll discover he picked the wrong family." For the first time in weeks, she managed a faint smile. Then her phone vibrated on the table. The screen lit up with one name. Richard. She stared at it, and all the color drained from her face. 10 minutes later, after she left the kitchen to make coffee, Richard quietly closed the door behind us. He leaned close enough that only I could hear him. "If you ever try to take her away from me," he whispered, "you'll regret it for the rest of your life." Then he smiled and walked away as if we'd just discussed the weather. My mother never answered the call. She simply stared at the screen until it stopped ringing. A few seconds later, another message appeared. "Richard, Carol, I'm worried. Please call me." Then another. "I know someone is filling your head with lies." A minute later, a third. "You can't hide from me forever." My mother looked at me, her hands trembling. "I told him I was grocery shopping," she whispered. "He knows something's wrong." I gently turned the phone face down on the table. "No," I said calmly. "He knows he's losing control." Over the next 2 days, we moved carefully. Military training had taught me that good plans aren't built on speed. They're built on patience. Before packing a single box, we met with one of the most respected family law attorneys in the county. Every threatening message, every suspicious bank transaction, every financial document, every screenshot, every piece of evidence was organized before anyone filed a single form. The attorney placed the divorce papers on the table and looked at my mother. "Once you sign these," he said quietly, "there's no going back." I looked at Mom. This time she didn't glance over her shoulder. She didn't ask for permission. She simply picked up the pen and signed her own name. For the first time in months, she looked free. That afternoon, while Richard attended a business conference, we returned to the house one final time. We packed only what mattered. Family photographs, important documents, my father's wedding ring, a few changes of clothes. Everything else stayed exactly where Richard had left it. We weren't running away. We were leaving a prison. By sunset, my mother was safely settled in my home. I checked every security camera, tested every motion sensor, and gave my closest neighbors Richard's photo, asking them to call me immediately if they saw him anywhere near the property. 2 days later, Richard was served with divorce papers at his office. His public image mattered more than anything. Receiving those papers in front of his colleagues shattered the perfect husband he'd spent years pretending to be. But instead of exploding, he became strangely calm. My mother's phone lit up again. "Richard, tell Carol I'll see her tonight." That was all. No shouting. No insults. Just one quiet sentence. It was far more frightening than anger. I immediately forwarded the message to our attorney and the sheriff's office. The deputy who called me back didn't hesitate. "If he comes to your property," he said, "stay inside. Units will already be on the way." "I understand," I replied. That evening, my mother sat silently in the living room, pretending to read the same page for nearly an hour. Then my security monitor chimed. A black luxury SUV rolled slowly onto the gravel driveway. It stopped. The driver's door opened. Richard stepped out, alone. He looked calmly toward the house. Then he started walking to the front door. He had no idea that this was the last day he would ever have control over our lives. I looked at my mother and kept my voice steady. "Go to the safe room," I said. "Lock the door and don't come out until I tell you." She hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll be okay." She nodded, disappeared down the hallway, and a second later I heard the reinforced door lock. I stepped onto the front porch and quietly closed the front door behind me. Richard stood at the bottom of the steps, perfectly calm. He smiled as though he were arriving for dinner instead of a confrontation. "Tell Carol to come outside," he said. "She doesn't need to be afraid of me. She made her choice." He chuckled. "No, you made it for her." "I didn't." He climbed the first step. "You're isolating her from her husband." "I'm protecting her." He sighed dramatically as if I were the unreasonable one. "If the deputies show up," he said, "they'll see a concerned husband trying to speak to his wife." That was Richard's greatest strength. He always wanted an audience. He always believed he could control the story. "I'm giving you one last chance," he continued. "Move aside." I think she made her own choice. For the first time since I'd met him, the smile disappeared. His carefully crafted image cracked. He tried to push past me and force his way into the house. I stopped him using only the force necessary to prevent him from entering, until law enforcement arrived. He froze. He looked at the way I had stayed calm from beginning to end. His expression slowly changed. Military? He asked quietly. The United States Navy. A long silence followed. SEAL? I gave a single nod. Before another word could be spoken, sheriff's deputies turned into the driveway. Their vehicles came to a stop, and moments later the deputies stepped onto the porch. I immediately moved back and kept my hands visible. The lead deputy already knew why they were there. Weeks of threatening messages, financial records, witness statements, and security footage had been provided long before that evening. Richard wasn't arrested because I stopped him. He was arrested because of the evidence. As deputies placed him in handcuffs, he looked toward my mother. She stepped onto the porch. For months, she'd been afraid to meet his eyes. Now she stood tall. A deputy asked gently, "Mrs. Collins, are you willing to give a statement?" She didn't hesitate. Yes. It was the strongest single word I'd heard her speak in months. Richard watched as the patrol car door closed. For the first time since I'd known him, nobody obeyed him. Months later, my mother testified with quiet confidence. She never looked down once. The court entered orders protecting her, addressing the financial abuse and intimidation, and ensuring Richard no longer had any control over her life. One afternoon, while we planted flowers outside her new home, she smiled at me. "You didn't save me because you were a Navy SEAL." She squeezed my hand. "You saved me because you never stopped being my daughter." I smiled. Real strength isn't about winning a fight. It's about helping someone reclaim their freedom and making sure they never have to ask permission to live their own life again. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Revenge Diaries for more unforgettable tales of betrayal, justice, and sweet revenge.